Good evening. This is Carol Gerstein, and you've tuned into the online seminar Carol Gerstein Invites, and I'm thrilled to have Alex Ross, the critic of The New Yorker and author of several incredible books, including one that he'll discuss with us today. It's a thrill to welcome Alex to the Hans Eisler Musikhochschule in Berlin, virtually to this seminar space. Now something is automatically playing by YouTube again, but now that has stopped. So the book, as you have seen, both in the mail that I sent out, and I think in many places where the book is being discussed widely, Wagnerism, Art and Politics in the Shadow of Music. It's an incredible achievement that I was just telling Alex seems Wagnerian in its scope and in the multitude of directions that the theme provokes Alex to illuminate and discuss. It's really encyclopedic, and I think we want to hear from Alex all about it. And as always, questions are welcome and encouraged, both in text and eventually, if there's something longer form, I might ask you to whether you'd like to speak in audio or in full picture. So please monitor your chat as participants. And it's a thrill to have all of you here. And I stop talking and welcome Alex. Good morning. Alex is joining us from LA. I know some people are in New York, some people are elsewhere. Some of us are on European Central Time, but here we are.
Well, hello, Carol, and greetings to everyone. Thank you for visiting and listening from so many far-flung places. And I'm honored to be part of this very distinguished series of speakers, this wonderful forum that Carol has organized, somewhat intimidated by those who have come before me in terms of their ability and stature, but I'll do my best. So yes, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to discuss my almost brand new book, Wagnerism, Art and Politics in the Shadow of Music, which has been the product of more than a decade of labor on my part, a fairly formidable undertaking, perhaps a slightly foolish one, but nonetheless one that I'm very glad I undertook, mostly for my own edification. The enormous cultural value that I gained from this extended immersion in Wagner's wake, Wagner's cultural wake, is essentially the topic of the book. Wagner himself is, of course, a presence on every page, looming and lurking everywhere. But to some extent, Wagner's own personality and body of work and all the problems attended upon them are somewhat to the side of the theme of the book, or they are the impetus, the sine qua non of the book. But what I'm really discussing is how Wagner was perceived, how he was understood by creative figures who came after him. And you know, at heart, this question of how music affects the world around it, how it acts in the world, is one that has always fascinated me and has sort of been central to my role as a critic. And I've been a music critic for almost 30 years now. But from the start, I wanted to take up the questions of music's role in society, music's wider cultural implications, its political implications, and not simply to talk about music as a somehow pure and separate sphere unto itself, which I ultimately don't think is possible to talk about music purely, entirely separate from the social sphere. I mean, one can talk about it in that way, but there's a great deal that's being missed in the process. And so, from the start of my career as a critic, I was fascinated by these connections, and it emerged from my upbringing, where music was very central to my life and to my education. And I studied piano at a very kind of rudimentary level, and also played the oboe in my school orchestra, but was most interested in composing or trying to compose. Efforts that never really went anywhere in particular, but I gained some experience of the joy and the difficulty of writing music. But at the same time, I was heavily invested in literature, in studying history, in painting, in film, various other cultural pursuits. And so I always wanted to see music intermingled with the world around it in every possible way. And of course, the great challenge in the world of classical music has so often been to push music into the field of vision of so many people who grow up with literature, painting, film, are sort of well-versed in all of these areas, but somehow lack the initial exposure to classical music, especially. And so it's been a long time project to propel classical music into that mainstream discussion. And there's really no better, no more fruitful opportunity to make those kinds of connections than with Wagner, for better or for worse. Wagner is hopelessly, inextricably entangled with social history, cultural history, and political history. And so I feel as though in some way I was always kind of fated to undertake this book, although it took a very long time actually for me to begin to come to terms with Wagner and find a kind of entree into Wagner, because my initial reaction to him was frankly one of repulsion. As a kid, I remember checking long playing records of Lohengrin out from the public library. This was a stage at which, the bread and butter of my musical existence was Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert, Brahms, maybe getting into a little bit of Bruckner and Mahler as I became a wild teenager. But essentially, it was the sort of Austro-German instrumental repertoire that was at the center of my existence. And Wagner made no sense to me. The Prelude to Lohengrin was this sort of amorphous gas cloud of music in which I could discern no clear themes or sort of thematic development. And so I rejected it at once. In college, as I was studying European history and literature in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, Wagner loomed everywhere as a problem, as a crisis in cultural history, as a wellspring of anti-Semitism, of hyper-nationalist chauvinism, of misogyny, perhaps, and various other shadowy forces. And so that was the sort of the lens through which I began to take Wagner seriously. But nonetheless, the music began to kind of take hold of me in various ways. And eventually, once I began experiencing Wagner in the theater, I understood more of the substance of the work in musical terms, in theatrical terms, in psychological terms. And I think ultimately, Wagner's greatest claim to immortality, perhaps, is his capacity to psychologize in operatic terms. And I think that has always been, at least for me, that is now the heart of his appeal. My first book was The Rest is Noise, and this was a cultural history of 20th century music with heavy emphasis on the political ramifications. And what I noticed as I worked in that book was how Wagner kept creeping into the discussion at various points. I was periodically distracted by Wagner and sort of pulled away from the matter at hand and sort of pulled backward to the question of Wagner, whether at the beginning of the book I was considering the world of Mahler and Strauss, and of course, you can't talk about Mahler and Strauss without talking about Wagner, sort of the very stature of the composer. At the beginning of the 20th century was sort of so much informed by what Wagner had achieved. And then later in the book, as I considered the fate of music in Nazi Germany, Wagner inevitably surfaced as well and sort of moved to the center of the discussion. And so I think by the time I was finishing that book, this distraction in the direction of Wagner almost sort of told me what it was that I should undertake next. And I think this is an interesting phenomenon, sort of that your next creative project can very often emerge from the current one and from detours that you find yourself making as you work on the current project. So in a sense, I felt like I had no choice. You know, this is what I was destined to do. And so I set about attempting to map what a book about Wagnerism would be. And at a very early stage, I made the decision that in discussing Wagner's posthumous impact and influence, I was going to set his musical influence aside. And this was a decision that has turned out to be somewhat controversial, judging from the reactions of some people who read the book, who found it puzzling that a professional music critic would largely avoid talking about music itself in a book titled Wagnerism. In fact, I do spend a considerable amount of time discussing the music at various points, especially at the beginning of each of the first 5 chapters. I take a particular Wagner work and use it as the springboard for what follows. And I was mindful writing those sections that there were going to be some readers who were not particularly familiar with Wagner. And so those segments of the book have a kind of introductory, a sort of oblique introductory aspect to them. But of course, just in order to assess Wagner's impact, one must study sort of specific moments at which major artists, major writers grappled with the stuff and substance of the work and what they did with it. But I decided simply not to speak about Wagner's admittedly enormous influence on subsequent composers, whether Debussy or Schoenberg or Alban Berg or Stockhausen, sort of various post-war composers. And the reason I did this was twofold. First, the book was already going to be long and turned out to be quite a bit longer than I had initially envisaged. And of course, if I had included Wagner's impact on 100 or more composers of his lifetime and generations that followed, the book would have been twice as long and would have been completely unmanageable. So to some extent, it was simply a pragmatic decision to limit the potentially infinite scope of this undertaking. But at the same time, I also felt that to talk about Wagner's purely musical influence was somehow to miss what makes this phenomenon called Wagnerism so striking and so singular. Because when you examine Wagner's musical influence, certainly it was massive, it was very widespread, but no more so than the influence of Bach or Monteverdi or Beethoven or Stravinsky, perhaps less so in some of those cases. I'm not sure you can make the argument that Wagner is as influential as Bach. And so Wagner is simply one of many composers in the sort of history of the classical canon who brought about some kind of paradigm shift in musical language, or who had a sort of exceptionally broad influence, and with whom subsequent generations sort of had to come to terms to some extent. But nothing I think extraordinary about his, excuse me, his influence on music. The influence outside of music was extraordinary. It was singular. I think it was somewhat unprecedented. I don't think there had ever been anything quite like it in cultural history in terms of composers sort of acting upon kind of the wider cultural world. And I don't think we've seen anything like it since. And so I think this is what makes the question of Wagner's extra musical influence pressing and worthy of examination. And so that is what I undertook in this book. And there is more than enough to talk about. So I thought I'll sort of simply try to sort of lay out the structure of the book and sort of overall view of how I went about assembling it. And then, of course, I'm eager to talk to Kirill and answer any questions. But the question of what is Wagnerism? You can interpret the word in many different ways. I chose to define it specifically as the phenomenon of the late 19th, especially sort of the heart of the narrative is the phenomenon of the late 19th, early 20th century, in which Wagner begins to become a kind of movement within the arts, a movement which is difficult to define in terms of style and genre, but nonetheless it was palpable. It was prominent, and however variegated sort of Wagner's influence was, there was a very considerable wave of composers, of artists who considered themselves to be following Wagner or sort of taking up ideas from Wagner in one way or another. And so this question of how music influences the other arts is at the heart of the book, which is a fascinating subject in and of itself. You know, how does a painter receive ideas from music? And what kind of language do we need to discuss such an influence? Or, you know, how does a novelist receive ideas derived from music? And this interdisciplinary aspect of the undertaking was sort of very much what drew me in. And I think there's a rich and fascinating world of scholars in various disciplines who are working on this question of Wagnerism. And one of the joys of the process was to come into contact with so many of them, to share ideas, to benefit from their enormous generosity, and to become one of this peculiar community of people working on the question of Wagnerism. Some of these scholars are musicologists who have branched out, in a sense, into literary studies or visual art studies or film studies. And from the other side, we see scholars in those other disciplines taking an interest in the Wagner question and sort of moving toward music. And so there's a wonderful way in which people working in these various disciplines are sharing techniques, sharing perspectives as they try to come to terms with Wagnerism. And one of these scholars, the historian Celia Applegate, has compared Wagnerism to the Schengen zone, essentially a zone in which the boundaries between disciplines are temporarily lifted, and there is a kind of a free movement from one discipline to another. And Wagner somehow encourages this movement. And I think it stems from Wagner himself, who was very much a sort of multidisciplinary phenomenon. To music, who really began, I think, in childhood as someone who loved the theater and wanted to put on little shows. And he would write texts and he would make music and he would design costumes and sort of put on these little shows. And so he wanted to be involved in every aspect of sort of the making of theater. And sort of almost to do it all himself. And as he developed in maturity, his interests broadened ever more to the point where he became something of a part-time architect as he helped to shape the design of the Festspielhaus in Bayreuth. He became a theoretician of a sort. He was, of course, a conductor, a theatrical director. And I think, Nietzsche always said that Wagner was at heart an actor. And Nietzsche meant it as something of an insult, that sort of Wagner was a mere actor. And he raised the question of, was Wagner actually a musical talent in a real sense, or was he a mere dilettante? And sort of the accusation of dilettantism took hold. Thomas Mann also flirted with it, and various other critics over the years. And I think there's an element of truth insofar as you define dilettantism as an interest in many neighboring disciplines. And I think the curious thing, as I say in my introduction, is that in order to study this phenomenon of Wagnerism, one is forced to become a dilettante. Only a dilettante could come to terms with this entire phenomenon, because no one has the full professional training in all of these different disciplines simultaneously, never mind all of the languages in which Wagnerism unfolds to grapple and to do justice to every segment of it. And so a kind of enlightened dilettantism, perhaps, is the operating principle. And I think that is what you find in this phenomenon of scholars branching out from their own field into neighboring fields in search of these cultural connections and this sort of cultural common ground through which you can make sense of this event called Wagnerism. So obviously the book was going to require me to move very widely through fields of literature, visual arts, dance, architecture, theater, film, and so on, because Wagnerism manifested itself in all of these areas. And of course, it was an international phenomenon as well. Every European country had some form of Wagnerism, and there was also American Wagnerism and Japanese Wagnerism, South American Wagnerism, various other forms. And so it is an absolutely enormous quantity of cultural material to grapple with. At a certain point, I came across this extraordinary volume. This is the Dictionnaire encyclopédique Wagner, edited by Timothée Picard, and it is a very considerable volume of, I think, 2,600 pages. And a lot of it is devoted to sort of Wagner himself, all the singers, whoever sang Wagner, or the major ones at least, conductors, people in Wagner's life, and so on. But a great deal of this book is also devoted to Wagnerism in all of various fields and in so many different countries. And so I found this book a couple of years into the process. I already had a great deal to deal with, and this this book, I blame Timothy Picard for setting back the project another year or two, because I began to realize that there was so much more than I had even suspected. And I had not actually heard of the novelist Marcel Batillat and his fantastically creepy novel, Cher Mystique, which involves a love affair between a tubercular woman and a man who sleeps with her in a frenzied way in order that he himself might be infected with the disease. And this sort of moves to the point where at the end of the novel, there's a scene of what can only be described as sort of amorous necrophilia, which is quite disgusting to contemplate, which I nonetheless included a sizable extract from in my book, just for the sake of covering all the bases, as it were. So, and this goes on and on. It's not just major figures with whom I'm sure all of you will be aware, Baudelaire, Mallarmé, Thomas Mann, Proust, Joyce, Eliot, Kandinsky, Meyerhold, Eisenstein, Buñuel, and so on and so forth. But many other obscure fin de siècle poets, novelists, and painters. And it was a great joy to sort of delve into these sort of darker corners of decadence and symbolism in the fin de siècle. I have some kind of unhealthy attraction toward this period, and have had such an attraction since I was a teenager, I suppose. And this is really the heart of the book. I mean, in a sense, this is in great measure a history of the cultural history of the fin de siècle, as seen through the lens of Wagner. But why did it happen? Why did Wagner assume such an extraordinarily high profile in the culture of that period? And it's a question for which I think there is no absolutely definite answer, or sort of several competing answers. But to understand it, one can go to the root of the matter, sort of the ground zero of Wagnerism, which is Baudelaire. And Baudelaire's essay, Richard Wagner and Townhoeser in Paris, which was published in 1861. So I'll talk about that event in a little bit of detail as a way of conveying the root of the phenomenon. So of course, Wagner came to Paris in late 1859 in the conviction that, having failed as a young man to make an imprint in Paris, this time he would break through. He was now an internationally well-known composer, albeit one who had been exiled from German lands because of his revolutionary activity. He had just completed his most extraordinary, his most revolutionary work, Tristan Undisolder, and he thought that the atmosphere in Paris was primed for this work, because he was aware of bohemian tendencies in French culture, avant-garde tendencies in French culture, taking notice of him. He knew that Gerard de Nerval had taken an interest in his work some years earlier. And sort of several other French critics were beginning to respond avidly to his music. And more widely, I think he just had the conviction that the sheer strength and power of his creation would break through whatever conservative resistance existed. And so he went to Paris in the expectation that Tristan would be staged there. And that, Germany having failed him, it would be in France that he would find his true home. That did not happen, of course, in the sense in which Wagner imagined it, but in another way. Wagner did find his home among followers in France. And the breakthrough with Baudelaire, I think, was the crucial signal that French culture quote unquote advanced or progressive French culture was going to respond to him in a dramatically avid way. And so Wagner organized concerts in early 1860 at the Théâtre Italien, and offered orchestral excerpts from his music. Baudelaire attended these concerts and was absolutely overwhelmed, completely overpowered by the music. He felt penetrated by the music, he said. He said so in a letter to Wagner, an extraordinary letter, which had no return address, because Baudelaire did not want to give Wagner the idea that he expected some kind of favor in return or anything in return. He sent this letter, sort of a pure statement of enthusiasm, of passionate response from one artist to another. And Wagner was very appreciative of the letter and responded and invited Baudelaire to his salon. In the months leading up to the famous scandal of 1861, Townhoeser at the Paris Opera. The Tristan performance, of course, did not come about, but the idea arose at the impetus of the Emperor, Napoleon III himself, that Wagner should be staged at the opera, and Townhoeser was the likeliest work for that project. And it was, relatively speaking, a failure. There was enthusiastic response to the opera, but there was also a sort of organized demonstration on the part of the Jockey Club, who were discontented by the whole presentation for various reasons, not just the famous rationale that they were upset that the ballet had occurred in the wrong place. But there were also sort of political forces at work, the Jockey being very much in the legitimist camp and opposed to the emperor, and also opposed to the Republican forces who were widely identified with Wagner at that time. And Wagner had many enthusiasts among the Republicans. But the Republicans had also reason to be discontented with Wagner because of this alliance with the emperor. So it was just kind of a political muddle that led to the failure of Tannhäuser at the opera. But Baudelaire was all the more convinced that Wagner was a figure of enormous cultural importance. And so he wrote this enormous, brilliant, eccentric, magnificent essay, Richard Wagner, Townhoeser in Paris, much of which is actually devoted to the concerts, of Wagner's concerts, rather than Tannhäuser itself, and especially to the Tannhäuser Overture and to the Prelude to Lohengrin. And the terms in which Baudelaire responds to Wagner are very striking. He responds to Wagner as a gateway to a transcendent state, a kind of elevated spiritual state, which is not presented in Christian terms. So when he talks about the Prelude to Lohengrin, he's not talking so much about the realm of the Grail and sort of the transport of the Grail. It's more abstract. It is a zone of sort of abstract luminosity. And this sort of pure mental elevation. And so this abstracting of Wagner's advanced musical language is an important development in the French reception of Wagner. And there is also, when Baudelaire talks about Tannhäuser, he talks about the radical sensuality of the music, the sense of primitive lusts and longings being unleashed, and he aligns them with the discussion of devilish or satanic energies. And he says that in the Venusberg music, one can sense a counter religion, a religion of Satanism. And this is really quite distinct from anything that Wagner ever disclose in terms of what his preoccupations were in composing Lohengrin, Tannhäuser. This comes from Baudelaire himself. Baudelaire is finding in Wagner's score a reflection, an echo of his own pre-existing obsessions, whether it is with a transcendent, a dream state or sort of liminal state of consciousness, or this plunge into another world, sexual or sensual or otherwise, Satanism, demonism, and the sort of the doorway to an extreme other realm. And this is the mode, one of the major modes in which French Wagnerism plays out. And those who follow Baudelaire, Villiers de l'Isle Adam, Mallarmé, the painters, especially Odilon Redon, the sort of radical and even anarchist camp in French culture, they respond very much to Wagner in these terms, as an avant-gardist, as a conduit for these extraordinary energies of dream, of the unconscious. And one very important development that happens in the 1880s is Eduard Dujardin's response to Wagner. Dujardin being, ultimately perhaps a figure of not high literary importance, but a writer of some note and of some originality. And Dujardin was absolutely besotted by Wagner, had overwhelming experiences when he went to Bayreuth. And he emerged with the conviction that the other art forms, especially literature, needed, in a sense, to catch up with Wagner. Sort of Wagner music had moved out ahead. And so a kind of Wagnerian literature and also a Wagnerian painting were required. Theodor de Wyzywa, the emigre Polish critic and author, felt very much the same way, and wrote expositions of what it would mean for there to be a Wagnerian painting or Wagnerian literature. And those essays were published alongside writings of Dujardin and Huysmans and various others in the remarkable journal Revue Wagnerienne, which existed for only 3 years in the 1880s, but was of enormous importance, not only as a site for sort of the most adventurous forms of French Wagnerism, but also as one of the sites in which the symbolist movement in literature and also in the visual arts comes into being in those very pages. It was the Revue Wagnerienne, which published 2 extraordinary Wagnerian sonnets by Verlaine and Mallarmé, which are integral to the emergence of symbolism literature. Of course, Mallarmé was already sort of well on the road to his extraordinary proto-modernist, fully modernist literary language before his moment of close contact with Wagner and Wagnerism in the 1880s. But the magazine, the journal, became a staging ground for symbolism as it emerged. And Dujardin went on to undertake some fascinating literary experiences in which he tried to apply the kind of flow of consciousness, the stream of endless melody that he perceived in Wagner, especially in Tristan Undisolder, to literature. And there were experiments in free verse that were sort of undertaken under the umbrella of that Wagnerian project. And then there was this extraordinary short novel, Les Lauriers sont coupés, which was an experiment in interior monologue. a sort of aesthete young man is walking around Paris on a particular day, and the hours pass, and the novel relates his flow of thought and feeling, often in a very mundane way. It's not a great success, I think, as a novel, but it was a crucial experiment which pointed ahead to future endeavors in this line, especially in the early 20th century, in the work of Virginia Woolf and James Joyce. And Joyce, in fact, named Dujardin as a crucial source of his own version of interior monologue. And perhaps he exaggerated Dujardin's influence somewhat in order to attract attention away from other literary figures who had affected him, George Moore, among others, but there's no reason not to believe that the influence was real. And so in that sense, there's this indirect influence on Joyce from through the medium of Dujardin. And of course, in Joyce's case, there was much more direct influence because he knew the corpus of Wagner very well. He had seen the operas many times. He studied Wagner's librettos, and he studied Wagner's writings. And the entire apparatus, I think, of Ulysses, this doubling of modernity and myth, owes something to Wagner. And so the modernism, sort of early modernism, as it follows symbolism and takes so much from symbolism, also takes a great deal from Wagner. And this is really the heart of the narrative of the book. I think these are sort of the major chapters, the sort of most in-depth studies for me is this series of figures who are moving into what we know as modernism, not only in the literary arena but also in the visual arts and in theatrical design. And Wagner is a moving force behind those developments. So if there is a sort of a single topic for the book, it is, what is the role that Wagner played in the emergence of modernism? Not an easy question to answer because modernism is so difficult to define to begin with. And then Wagner's influence played out in so many different ways. And there were those who actively rejected Wagner, and yet behind the scenes were receiving some impetus for him. And I think Joyce falls into that category. But that is sort of the richest cultural territory of the book. And so the several major chapters are devoted to that story of Wagner and the emergence of modernism. But there are many other aspects to the picture as well. And so I have chapters devoted to geographical studies. And so what is going on in other parts of the world as Wagner penetrates culture. And I have a chapter devoted to the British Isles and to America, where Wagner's profile is quite different. And there's much more emphasis on myth and legend. There is a kind of a genteel version of Wagner who's much more concerned with spiritual elevation. There is a kind of archetype of the Wagnerian hero being transplanted into the British context or the American context. I take up the question of Wagner's political impact, and not only on the right, but also on the left. And several chapters are concerned with that issue, which comes more and more to the fore as the book goes on. And I also have several chapters thematically devoted to questions of Wagner and race, and Wagner and gender and sexuality, which is a fascinating area to explore, I think, because of course our received idea is that Wagner's profile is going to be conservative, reactionary, and antagonistic to these minority identities. in Western culture. And yet that doesn't prove to be the case. And so despite Wagner's ferocious anti-Semitism, you find a great many Jewish Wagnerians who are not merely of the kind of self-hating sort of hyper-assimilationist sort of conservative variety, but also you find Theodor Herzl having quite a strong relationship with Wagner, even if it is one of sort of radical appropriation, as he sees Wagner almost as a model for a heroic new Jewish culture, Zionist culture. And you find the same with W.E.B. Du Bois, who is a fanatical devotee of Wagner. The great Black American author and philosopher and civil rights activist, who in the same way sees Wagner as a model for a heroic Black art that would use native traditions and native legends in the same way that Wagner used Nordic and Teutonic legends. So that's a fascinating relationship. And we find a number of other African-American intellectual figures who had a strong engagement with Wagner. So I explore the contradictions and ironies of those relationships. And eventually heading toward a climactic chapter devoted to Hitler and Nazi Germany, the everlasting problem of Wagner's afterlife as a symbol of Nazi propaganda, the question of to what extent is anti-Semitism present in the operas themselves? Did Wagner's anti-Semitism have a material effect on the development of anti-Semitism in Germany? To what extent did it play a role in the emergence of Nazi ideology? Very difficult questions to which I don't give, frankly, very, very clear, unambiguous answers. I think it's a very complicated question, sort of the role that Wagner played in Nazi Germany. And I end up falling back on a formulation of Thomas Mann's to the effect that Thomas Mann was deeply ambivalent about Wagner and also so deeply passionate on the question of Wagner, was very aware of the darker, more shadowy energies that existed in Wagner, but could not bring himself to dismiss or to demonize Wagner on those grounds. And so he created a kind of a thin line separating Wagner from Nazi ideology. And what he said was that Wagner lent a handle, had a hand in his own misuse. The German phrase is die Handhabe bieten. So Wagner gives a handle to his own misuse in the sense that on the one hand, Wagner was misused, distorted, caricatured, simplified in Nazi Germany. The complexities and the contradictions of Wagner's politics were swept aside. But at the same time, there was enough in Wagner that pointed toward Nazi ideology, that Wagner cannot be absolved of a role in this misuse, and so he participates in his own abuse. A somewhat evasive formulation, as is so often the case with Thomas Mann, but I think in a strange way, Mann's habitual evasiveness helps us get to the point, insofar as it is a hugely ambiguous and complex situation. What role Wagner was playing in Nazi culture, and it's sort of prone to simplification. Finally, at the end of the book, I take up the question of Wagner in Hollywood. Exploring the question of why Hollywood was so avid for Wagner from the very beginning, whether it was organizing film scores along the lines of sort of leitmotif structures, Wagner's music itself being heard so often in not just Hollywood films, but sort of films around the world. Wagner himself appearing as a character in quite a few movies, scenes in which people are listening to Wagner and responding to Wagner, and the various kind of archetypes that such scenes fall into, whether a kind of mad love, a sort of out of control passion with Tristan Undisolder, or especially after the Second World War, Wagner being used as a signifier of Nazism, racism, belligerent attitudes of various kinds, sort of a signifier of musical violence. And the history of the Ride of the Valkyries on film is particularly important in that regard, reaching its climax, in a sense, in the famous helicopter scene in Apocalypse Now, where a remarkable transformation takes place. And so often in films, Wagner had been used as a signifier of German aggression, of Nazi aggression. There it is used as a signifier of American aggression. And I think very consciously, very provocatively, Francis Coppola and the editor John Milius are transplanting Wagner from the German Nazi context to the American one, and letting the viewer know, in a sense, that this music of imperialist aggression sort of is now more fitting to the American Manifest Destiny project than to the German one. A provocative irony that was immediately overlooked. And of course, the problem with irony is that it can very easily be ignored. And so you have the extraordinary situation of Wagner being positively embraced as a signifier of exactly this kind of aggression that the film seems to have been designed to critique. And you have American military forces actually using Wagner, the Ride of the Valkyries, in combat situations in order to soldiers revving themselves up and prepping themselves for battle. And of course, any number of films in which the Ride of the Valkyries sort of is just kind of the proper music for a scene of heroic sort of military action. And so the Wagner's fate, the way Wagner's fate plays out in Hollywood is so typical of the complexity and the circuitousness of his entire history in the cultural arena. And I end with a sort of overview of Wagnerism today. Of course, greatly diminished from its heyday at the fin de siècle, but nonetheless substantial, and sort of many fascinating case studies to be undertaken, whether with Anselm Kiefer or this is really sort of post-1945 era, Ingeborg Bachmann, Philip K. Dick, fantasy culture in Hollywood, The Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, the Matrix movies, and closing with the question of the ecological Wagner. The scholar Thomas Gray has coined the phrase eco-Wagner to pinpoint a tendency, especially in modern day Wagner productions, to use Wagner's operas, especially The Ring, as a parable for humanity's destruction of nature, and as a theme that fits very well, of course, with the substance of the work itself, because there was a kind of proto-environmental consciousness in Wagner, and Wagner's concern with the disruption and destruction of nature, and also his concern for the well-being of animals and his vegetarianism and so on. And so I close with some scenes in films of Werner Herzog and Terrence Malick, in which that quote-unquote eco-Wagner can also be seen coming to the fore. So I think I should probably wind up the solo exposition segment as we head into the second hour. There's no somehow brief or terse way of talking about these matters. Yes, I'd love to throw it over to you, Kirill, at this stage, and see where the conversation might lead us.
Oh, this is really also, if there can be a Wagnerian teaser, then this is it, because I don't think we could have or should have done it shorter, but there's so much to do for us. I think all of us need to read the book now to follow the outline that you've given, and you sort of touch upon it, and you also in the text you sent me originally about the seminar, you do say that you promise no easy answers, but of course I think the question beckons of so what is it that has exerted such incredible influence on so many of these creative minds, and essentially on our culture and thought generally? And I understand there will be no easy answer. You already said, and I see in the comments that Professor Paul Boghossian, who was also one of our speakers last semester, Music and Meaning was his talk, says he's rather surprised that the claim influence of music composition, Wagner's influence on music composition was not outsized. But I do agree with you that, yes, I think as incredible and influential Wagner was, there were other composers. I think, you correct me if I'm wrong, if one looks at his efforts as literary ones, also perhaps there are equal and perhaps much more, let's say, rounded writers that there have been. And so if one goes through these different elements, which by themselves are perhaps so somewhat reduced. So then, is it the Gesamtkunstwerk? What is it, do you think, that really captures and has been capturing the minds for so long?
Yeah, I think ultimately it comes down to the combination of words and music, and Wagner floated the idea of Gesamtkunstwerk, and it is a powerful idea that, of course, has had a long afterlife, especially in the 20th century. And it's actually really only at the beginning of the 20th century that the discussion of Gesamtkunstwerk really came to the fore. Before that, it had not been so widely discussed, and Wagner himself actually only used the word on 5 occasions in 2 of his essays, and then sort of set it aside to some degree. And so this idea of sort of the total combination of all the arts, the visual elements, dance, sort of all the elements that go into theater, or even sort of beyond the theater, the kind of multimedia Gesamtkunstwerk, which is sort of now possible in the digital age. That's all very interesting, but when you get down to it, Wagner's arresting and original contributions came with music and words, as his visual imagination was not so great. His tastes in painters were sort of certainly not toward the adventurous end of the spectrum. He loved Hans Makart. He apparently had little interest in the Impressionists to the extent that he ever actually engaged with Impressionist art. It's actually a very bizarre, fascinating moment in Renoir's recollection of his conversation with Wagner. Renoir went to see Wagner in Palermo in early 1882 and sketched this strange, not particularly attractive portrait of Wagner at that time. And it was immediately after he had finished Parsifal that he sat for this portrait. Perhaps I will attempt to show it here. Can we see that?
Yes, yes.
Renoir, yes. So that's Wagner as seen by Renoir. So apparently the question of Impressionism came up, and Wagner made some kind of dismissive comment about I don't think it was even, it just, the topic of impressionists in music was supposedly came up, and what on earth they talked about. Who were they talking about in terms of impressionists in music in 1882? You know, you wish you knew a little more. But in any case, he simply was not very imaginative, very adventurous in his taste in the visual arts, and he had sort of very limited ideas about dance. So it was about words and music, and that's something.
I think we don't hear you for a second.
The combination, not necessarily, you know, sort of any more overwhelming in significance as sort of any number of other composers. When you consider the texts themselves, of course, there are many grounds for complaint, and the pain that many native German speakers feel in contemplating Wagner's very peculiar version of the German language, both in the librettos and perhaps even more problematically in the prose essays. The sort of ersatz medieval sort of kind of version of the German language. But when you combine these two forces together, something is released. And of course, this is such a singular phenomenon of the composer who wrote, you know, all his own librettos, and there are others after him who imitated that fashion. But Wagner had real strengths as a dramatist. You know, whatever his limitations as a stylist, he had great instincts as a dramatist in terms of how each act of his operas is organized, how action flows, how moments of stasis give way to moments of action. And of course, above all, the psychology, the way he takes these mythic legendary characters such as Wotan and Brunhilde, and Kundry, and Tristan Undisolder, and broadens them and deepens them, and sort of essentially makes them into characters of a sort of psychological richness comparable to figures in great bourgeois novels, and the sort of particular, I think, sense of solidarity almost that novelists felt with Wagner has to do with his way of presenting these fascinating and ambiguous characters against this huge dramatic landscape and sort of the action that swirls around them. And I think George Eliot was impressed by that as much as she had doubts about the Wagnerian project. I think Henry James, another skeptic, would have taken note of that. And the major novelists that I mentioned of the early 20th century were very much aware of this aspect of Wagner. And above all, Thomas Mann. And Buddenbrooks, you know, is to some extent a sort of a ring cycle in modern US. The decline of a family, beginning with the triumphant but ill-fated entry into the new home on Mengstrasse, which is a kind of a sort of allegory of Valhalla, or Valhalla is an allegory for it, and sort of these symbols and kind of sort of legendary sort of archetypes, you know, lurking behind the modern surface of the novel, and so there's a great sense of kinship there, and sort of the charging of these literary situations by the music, and the music's, you know, the music's power to cast a spell of whatever kind to sort of put the listener into a trance. You know, this was such a widely noted phenomenon in the late 19th century, sort of endless reports of especially young people being swept away and sort of reduced to a kind of, trembling ecstasy by Wagner. Nietzsche talks about this in a quite disapproving way, and of how sort of men and women alike are sort of dominated by and sort of overwhelmed by Wagner. But I think the very crucial component of this mechanism of the spectator being overpowered and sort of sent into this dream state, trance state, by the magic, of Wagnerian sound, the orchestration, the dematerialization of themes into kind of these endless flowing textures, is that when the spectator emerges from that experience, he or she is not necessarily simply the receptacle for Wagner's own ideas and intentions. Very much the opposite. I think so often you find someone like Baudelaire emerging with an extremely idiosyncratic, sort of independent-minded, at times really antagonistic idea of what the operas are really about. And so, having been dominated by the work, the spectator then proceeds to take possession of the work and transpose it and sort of transmute it into something entirely new. Now, this is a process, I think, that is completely commonplace, with every work of art, especially any work of art that endures past its time or sort of spreads beyond sort of its immediate context. These kinds of transmutations will inevitably occur. Look at Shakespeare, Dante, figures who have just undergone endless transformations. And so Wagner is no different in that respect. But in terms of the particularly dramatic phenomenon of Wagnerism in the late 19th century, sort of early 20th century, I think this process of sort of being entranced and then sort of having one's own inner convictions being released in sort of heightened and amplified form just happened to align themselves with a number of crucial forward-moving cultural and political tendencies of the period in a way. And perhaps it's sort of just a trick of the eye. Perhaps it's an illusion, that sort of Wagner sort of happens to be on the scene when modernism is coming to the fore, when the right wing, the sort of hyper-nationalist, anti-Semitic right wing is sort of advancing, when feminism is advancing, when sort of gay rights are advancing, and sort of Wagner just sort of happens to be there on the scene because this was a period in which so many younger people especially had this rather everyday experience of being swept away by Wagner. But I think there is a little more to that. And I think Wagner had a special power again, to contribute this sort of explosive energy of the music, of the words, and of the mythic archetypes embodied in the words, to play a leading role in this transition, essentially, from the Romantic era to the modern and everything that it entailed.
While I catch you on the subject of writers in that period, there is a question from Professor Susanna Klingenstein from Boston. She says, amazing presentation. Could Mr. Ross please comment a bit more on the connection between Wagner and Proust, who seems to have resisted Wagner's magnetism? But in fact, I know in the book you devote some space to Proust and Wagner, so I think this would be interesting.
Yes, well, Proust is, one could write a whole book about Proust and Wagner. Jean-Jacques Nattier more or less did that in Proust Musicien. And so to try to squeeze the whole question of Proust and Wagner into the final section of one chapter of my book, as I was forced to do, was difficult. I have my beautiful Pléiade edition of Proust there. Yeah, I would not say that Wagner, that Proust resisted Wagner's magnetism. And Proust was actually devoted to Wagner throughout his life. And at a time, especially during the First World War, when many French Wagnerites were having second thoughts about their Wagnerian enthusiasm. And there was this whole move to denounce Wagner and make him to be a kind of a symbol of German aggression. And the campaign that Camille Saint-Saëns organized against Wagner, throwing all manner of accusations in Wagner's direction, including no, this wasn't Saint-Saëns. That was another critic who threw out the phrase Wagner Pederast. The point was that there's this very strong movement against Wagner, and Proust defended Wagner, and he thought this was insipid and absurd. This sort of blaming Wagner for modern day German aggression. So he stayed loyal to that form of French Wagnerism that we see going back to Baudelaire. But with Proust, it did take a different form. And so I think you don't find in Proust this sort of unrestrained, over the top obsession and a transport that you see, for example, with Villiers de la Dame. There's something more restrained and refined and perhaps detached about Proust's Wagnerism. And he was deeply affected by the work, but it doesn't sort of have a kind of overpowering sort of central role. You see Wagner alongside Debussy, alongside Fauré and Saint-Saëns among Proust's musical enthusiasms, and so he doesn't overrate Wagner in that sense. He doesn't overload Wagner with significance, and I think there is a sense of, I would say, quiet rivalry with Proust's entire project, with Temps Perdu, and the sense, which I think you also find with Joyce, that he is creating a work that rivals and perhaps surpasses Wagner in its scope. And so if Wagner writes a tetralogy, Proust writes a septology. And there's a sense in which an epic of Wagnerian scope is folded into this contemporary French story, and is perhaps subdued. Perhaps sort of this great German mythic work is subdued and domesticated by the role that it plays. And so Proust he's never too overwhelmed by Wagner, but he looked to Wagner in terms of developing a leitmotif structure in the novels, and Wagner himself becomes a leitmotif, and Wagner kind of appears as a point of reference repeatedly. And then I think most fascinatingly, there's the process by which, as Nattier showed, Proust converted passages of musical description that were originally intended for scenes in which Marcel or other characters or Swann were listening to Wagner into passages in which the same characters are listening to the fictional composer Vinteuil. And it's an absolutely remarkable transformation, because Vinteuil is obviously a completely different composer from Wagner. You know, he's known, the works that are discussed in the novels are chamber music. There's a violin sonata, and then there's a septet. And you know, the style in which these works are composed is just probably somewhere in the vicinity of Fauré, Franck, perhaps edging toward Debussy, and sort of very much sort of not Wagnerian, you know, on the surface. And yet the same phrases are applied to, it would have been the Good Friday spell, and instead it becomes Van Toy's music, which is, there almost might be a kind of a joke inherent in that transposition. You know, it's almost a joke on music criticism, my own profession, that sort of phrases can be sort of arbitrarily plucked from sort of one context to a completely different context and still be perfectly applicable, you know, and so the sort of that's perhaps the limitation of music criticism in terms of its exactitude. But I think also there's a wonderful sense in which Proust is pinpointing the more subtle, the more sort of under subterranean kind of presence of Wagner in French music. And of course, we know in the case of Debussy how much Wagner is present, you know, despite the sort of anti-Wagnerian surface of so much of Debussy's music. And so that's, I think there's something quite interesting there. And I think it also is, I think, again, a kind of domestication of Wagner, or sort of putting Wagner, sort of reducing Wagner to his sort of proper size in the sort of the landscape of sort of the French salon, where, you know, it could be Wagner, it could be Van Toy, it could be Saint-Saëns, you know, sort of everything kind of flows together. But yeah, it's a complicated relationship, but I think ultimately Proust simply loved Wagner's music, never backed away from it. Its presence in the work is quite a bit more ambiguous, and I would say in that sense, yes, Proust resists Wagner's magnetism by not staging these kinds of scenes that you find in other writers of the period of Wagner just having this absolutely overwhelming, overpowering effect.
Mm. By the way, there was an interesting comment from Amanda Jane Doran earlier in the chat, where the original use of Gesamtkunstwerk was for the presentation of visual art accompanied by music and displayed in a theatrical manner. For example, the work of Runge, circa 1800. But I wanted to catch you still while we were so on the subject of writers, and so you make a good case for why he's appealing to writers. Why is he appealing to a philosopher, or is he appealing to a philosopher like Nietzsche as a writer, or what do you think is so inspiring to, let's say, a professional philosopher in Wagner's creative? Is the inspiration the creative act, or is the inspiration really in the concepts presented by the libretti, or what is your impression in the case of Nietzsche and obviously further on?
Yeah, well, that's also a very rich topic in itself that is sort of treated rather sparingly in the book, especially in the first chapter and then in the last. In the first chapter of the book, I sort of introduced the ring cycle and the kind of genesis and development of the ring cycle in political terms and also in philosophical terms, of course, because we know how much sort of particular philosophers played a role in the evolution of Wagner's ideas generally, and in the sort of shape of the ring cycle in particular, and the movement from sort of engagement with young Hegelians, and especially with Feuerbach, to the so-called discovery of Schopenhauer in 1854, at a point where the librettos were already written, but one can discuss the influence of Schopenhauer's ideas on the scores, on the music as they developed, and of course subsequently on the librettos of Tristan, Meistersinger, and Parsifal. And then I introduce Nietzsche in counterpoint. I view Baudelaire as the first Wagnerian, so the sort of the first major figure in this genealogy of Wagnerism. But I look at Nietzsche first because he is such an archetype. He is Nietzsche's early fanatical embrace of Wagner, his break from Wagner, his arrival at philosophical intellectual maturity, and the persistence of Wagner in his work, even as he is outwardly turning away from Wagner, is just encapsulates sort of the entire relationship that sort of culture and sort of the intellectual world have with Wagner in toto, in sort of the very biggest picture as we go from the 19th to the 20th centuries. Infatuation followed by rejection or a degree of detachment, and yet Wagner lingers. And so the question of Wagner and philosophy begins with Wagner himself, begins with his philosophical passions, but Wagner becomes a topic in philosophy because of Nietzsche, and I think simply because of Nietzsche's rise to prominence in the 20th century and the vast influence that he came to exert on philosophy right up to the present day, meant that sort of subsequent philosophers had to deal with Wagner as well, and so it becomes a topic, and subsequent philosophers, of course, some of them had their own strong engagement with Wagner and wanted to incorporate Wagner into their own work, and so this is another way, perhaps, in which Wagner becomes singular. That it becomes a problem in philosophy, a topic, a problem. So there's something so huge about sort of the Wagner moment that it sort of registers not just in sort of political history, social history, but in intellectual history, in the history of philosophy. And so having sort of done a very rough exposition of the Wagner-Nietzsche relationship in the first chapter, I return to Wagner and philosophy in the final chapter, and move through a succession of figures from Heidegger to Adorno and Ernst Bloch, to Claude Lévi-Strauss, to French post-structuralists, Lacoue-Labarthe, especially, and then contemporary figures such as Alain Badiou and Slavoj Žižek, and sort of the recurring ways in which philosophers have grappled with Wagner. And this is deserving of a book in itself. Brian McGee wrote such a book, but that was more about how Wagner responded to philosophers. What role did philosophers play in Wagner's work? I think the history of philosophers themselves responding to Wagner remains to be written in full. And yeah, I won't be the one to do that.
And sort of just, and there's some interesting questions that will come next as well. But that are already in the chat. But do you think, then going through the chapters a little bit, the appeal of Wagner, as you said, to these rather disparate groups of the African American thinkers, the Jewish figures and leaders of the Zionist movement, as Herzl was. Do you think it's because Wagner is an outsider most of the time, or casts himself an outsider when even when he isn't, that this is the sort of the vector through which he appeals to so many disparate groups that, as you also point out, are rather surprising that they are so attracted to Wagner, who may have been anti-Semitic, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, that's an excellent point.
Outsider appeal, so to say.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think that's crucial, because for all that Wagner became this mighty symbol of the German nation and German, sort of the German national culture, Wagner spent so much of his life wandering from place to place. I have a recently published book, actually. Yeah, here we go. Wanderer heißt mich die Welt, a lavishly illustrated coffee table volume, pinpointing every single place across Europe that Wagner lived or spent time at one time or another, hundreds of places. And so he was constantly wandering. Of course, there was the dramatic moment of exile from Germany in 1849. And then there were sort of any number of other flights from one place or another, usually from crises of Wagner's own making, whether financial creditors pursuing him or the whole mess in Munich after King Ludwig II had taken him up and given him support, and the snarl of issues that he created there, political, sexual, and otherwise. And then the fact that, having settled in Bayreuth in the years leading up to the inaugural Bayreuth Festival in 1876, I think there's a sense in which Wagner became somewhat unhappy in Bayreuth. I mean, he was very unhappy with the festival itself, the financial outcome and sort of all the problems attendant upon it, the disappointment that the new German Empire did not devote massive resources to his festival. He wandered again, so at the end of his life, ostensibly for health reasons mostly, he was going to Italy. But I think there was also just this instinct for him to keep wandering from place to place. And so it's just no accident that he dies in Venice. And he was away from Bayreuth for much of those last several years. And so Wagner was a wanderer, an outsider. And of course, there's so many wanderers and outsiders in the operas. I mean, that's sort of even more important, I think, than the biographical details. The Flying Dutchman, the eternal wanderer of the oceans, Lohengrin roaming from the realm of the Grail to Antwerp for whatever reason, in pursuit of whatever project he has in mind. Townhoeser, with the pilgrimage to Rome and this vacillation between the Venusberg and the Wartburg. The wanderings of Tristan Undisolder and the Ring, Siegmund's flight, Wotan becoming the wanderer in Siegfried, Siegfried's Rhine journey. Again, what is the purpose of that? What is Siegfried's agenda as he goes off to Neue Taten? What?
Wanderlust.
Yeah, and Parsifal's, Parsifal's wanderings. It's mysterious. What did he do between Acts 2 and Act 3 of the opera? I'll show another couple of images. Are we seeing anything?
Yes, yes.
Yes, so this is Au-delà Redon. This is the young Parsifal, evidently, with a spear that's quite petite. It looks more like an arrow, perhaps. And this is presumably the Parsifal of Act 3. And what an extraordinary transformation just in stylistic terms, these works are 20 years apart. And so in the second one, we are sort of well into Rodin's sort of semi-abstract dream world. But I think it plots a transformation in Parsifal's character in a quite spectacular way. And there's still a likeness, I think, in the eyes, especially, but otherwise, I don't know, it almost seems as though the lower half of Parsifal's face has been eaten away. I mean, it's a beard there, but it's just something sort of strangely skull-like about what remains of his face. And so, yes, you know, these wanderers, these outsiders become objects of identification. This seeking of a home is such a great theme in Wagner, and so there you can see sort of how Theodor Herzl might have attached himself to it. W.E.B. Du Bois and the identification with Lohengrin's vain search for a place in which he can come to rest and be acknowledged for who he is without having to disclose who he is, you know, and that's sort of that non-disclosure of identity, sort of the hidden identity, also helps to explain why Jewish and also gay spectators found Wagner's characters compelling. So yeah, that's a great contradiction between sort of Wagner, the nationalist hero, and Wagner, the exile, the wanderer, the outsider, is certainly very crucial to his enduring presence.
Susanna Malki is here. She says,
oh.
Bravo for the book. Can't wait to get my hands on it. Too many possible subjects, but I was wondering if Mr. Ross might comment on Wagner's position as a precedent, not only of modernism and political activism of all kinds, but also the New Age with his Buddhism and the mysticism, etc., also apparent in the music, ?
Excellent point. Of course, I'm a great admirer of Susanna Melky and honored that she's here. Yes, I devote a chapter of the book to Wagner and essentially alternative spiritualities. And this was a very big phenomenon right at the end of the 19th century, because especially of Parsifal and its composite of religious traditions. And this, you know, it had happened earlier in Wagner. I think one aspect of Wagner's work, which is so striking, is his ability to perceive common patterns among different mythic traditions and also religious traditions. Certainly wasn't the first to do this, but he did it in a quite perceptive and lucid way. Actually, strange to say, given his general lack of lucidity, but his exposition of this point about sort of the sort of common patterns among myths of various traditions is just sort of it's strikingly put in the theoretical writings, and then of course the exposition in the works is striking as well. And this is something that Levi-Strauss especially praised Wagner for, and named him the father of structural mythology. Joseph Campbell also prized Wagner on those grounds. And so, you know, having sort of created these sort of mythic composites in the ring, he proceeded to create these religious composites in Parsifal, and draws upon Christian, Buddhist, pagan, and other Eastern traditions. Hindu and Islamic strains have been found in the sort of Parsifal composite as well, leading to this kind of very typical, I think, fin de siècle urge to mix and match, sort of select elements of these sort of various religious traditions in an effort to create a kind of new amalgam, which would reject the sort of institutional baggage of the leading world religions, and to rejuvenate spirituality itself in a fresh and contemporary form. And you can see this in sort of Parisian mystics and occultists, Josephin Péladan, the magnificently eccentric Rosicrucian novelist and art impresario. You also see it in theosophists, theosophy engaging with Wagner, and that Western Eastern composite, of course, is just absolutely central to theosophy. William Ashton Ellis, incidentally, the deeply problematic English translator of Wagner's prose writings, was a theosophist and was actually Madame Blavatsky's doctor. And Madame Blavatsky credited Ellis with saving her from a medical crisis. And after that, she began to have positive things to say about Wagner, whom she had previously dismissed. And Rudolf Steiner, anthroposophy, and just other fin de siècle spiritual traditions engaging with Wagner. And it continues. And I think one really interesting aspect of sort of latter-day Wagnerism is Philip K. Dick's revival of this kind of mystical, occult, Parsifalian Wagnerism in his later novels. And those are not the classic sci-fi ones, but the more mystical final ones, Valis and his exegesis, his sort of body of theoretical writings, or whatever you want to call them, and so it goes on almost up to the present day. So yeah, it's a really rich topic for exploration, and my own feeling actually is that Wagner himself did not necessarily have these mystical propensities in terms of his own sort of personal spiritual practice, whatever that might have been. I think he found it useful from the theatrical standpoint to weave together these traditions. I think it just sort of interested him as a creative project to find those commonalities. I don't think he was so deeply invested in the traditions themselves. He simply found it striking that so many common elements appear.
Well, once we're close to the subject of religions, then it's hard to resist the urge to not move on to morality and to ask you to speak a little bit about that. I mean, I think you quote Auden, if I remember correctly, in his conversation with Stravinsky, where he says that Wagner was an absolute shit, aside from being a genius. And it seems to me that if one ever needed an example of or proof that a great creator, a great artist does not need to necessarily be a great person or a person of great morals. I think Wagner is a low-hanging fruit, but to this hope or idealist desire that well, if so and so wrote so beautifully or painted so beautifully or composed such beautiful music Mr. Wagner did, there's no way he wasn't a wonderful person. And it's interesting that this is not only something that people generally grapple with, but also it seems some of these very critical thinkers and philosophers you speak about had to in some way jump through the hoops of Wagner's problematic humanity.
Yeah. Well, this is of course a very rich and current topic, since the issue of the dark pasts inherent in our canon is sort of so much to the fore, and Wagner is just the most spectacular case of a major artistic figure who arrives with so many just innumerable problems, and the problem of anti-Semitism is of course the largest of them. And so what do we do about that? I think there are two extremes to this discussion. On the one hand, there are the Wagnerites who are simply unwilling to admit, because of their devotion to the music, that there is something that's very problematic about the man himself, or who are keen to sort of apologize or cover up. At the other extreme, you find people who say that Wagner was so hateful and demonic a figure that we shouldn't even be listening to him or playing him. And you can find the argument that Wagner was not merely a ferocious anti-Semite, but he was a proto-Nazi, that he was a prophet of Nazism, that he was the primary influence on Hitler's entire intellectual and political makeup, that he was an architect of the Holocaust. People have gone so far as to say these things, and my opinion naturally lies in the middle. On the one hand, I absolutely do not want to cover up, disguise the darker aspects of Wagner's character, but at the same time, I don't want to be too carried away by this demonization, which I think, there are two problems to it. And first of all, I just don't think Wagner was a supremely evil man, despite his many ugly characteristics. He was not one of the worst people who ever lived, and I think I find there are aspects to Wagner's personality that are very, very appealing as well. I think there was an instinct of empathy, of compassion in Wagner, which tended not to play out in sort of the day-to-day kind of real life situation, but it's present in his work. The way in which he treats his so-called villains, the empathy with which Alberic, for example, is treated in The Ring. I find Alberic to be an extraordinary character and a very moving character. I identify with Alberic, this whole sequence from the sort of the arrogant fake flirtation of the Rhine maidens, and then his anger that his rightful claim to the ring, to the gold, has been defied by the trickery of the gods, and the curse that he places upon it. It's a grand and noble moment. Alberic's curse, and so there are no sort of unambiguous villains in Wagner, and there really are no unambiguous heroes. The blonde, supposedly Aryan hero Siegfried turns into a rather unsavory character, by the time you get to Götterdämmerung, as Wagner himself said. He said sort of the mature Siegfried is horrible. The charming part of Siegfried is the stupid boy. And so heroism is shaded and nuanced in Wagner as villainy is shaded and nuanced. So I find that tremendously appealing in Wagner. The second issue with this demonization of Wagner, especially when you come to the question of Nazism, is that it can turn into a kind of scapegoating, where if Wagner is assigned too much responsibility for the sort of emergence of Nazi ideology, then you are letting a great many other people off the hook. And of course, the history of anti-Semitism in German culture, in European culture, in world culture goes far, far back. And Wagner was simply one of many who played a role. And so to sort of make Wagner out to be a kind of a bogeyman is very problematic. It's a simplification, and as I said earlier, there are many aspects of Wagner's political makeup which contradict Nazi ideology, and that should not be overlooked either. And there was an anarchist streak in Wagner, a socialistic streak. Even at the end, when he was supposedly at the height of his conservatism, he seemed to be veering back at times toward a kind of anarchism. His disillusionment with the German Empire meant that he was sort of turning against militarism as well. He said a number of times that a political state should not have a standing army. It's very difficult to imagine a totalitarian regime without a standing army. So all of these aspects of Wagner's political makeup had to be disguised, overlooked by the Nazis. Parsifal was a problem for the Nazis, the ethic of compassion in Parsifal. What I talk about in that chapter is that in Nazi Germany itself, there were people who found Wagner to be problematic, as a symbol of Nazi culture. There are people who felt that he was too decadent, too bohemian. There was something sexually questionable about Wagner, something unhealthy. There were questions about his closeness to Jews. There were questions about whether Wagner himself had Jewish ancestry. And there's a pathetic letter that Winifred Wagner wrote to Himmler, begging him to put a stop to such talk about the Wagner family's Jewish ancestry. And so it surfaced during the Nazi regime, despite Hitler's worshipful attitude toward Wagner. And so Wagner could not be completely assimilated to Nazi ideology, which is not to overlook, again, the fact that there was very much a reason why Wagner became such a propaganda symbol. And as Thomas Mann said, he played a role, he lent a handle to that misuse.
But it's what you write about and quotes about backshadowing and the temptation to read all of German history as sort of this linear curve towards the abyss. I think there it's a strong and actual point that perhaps the temptation is too strong to read it as a straight line. And
yeah, I mean, it becomes a version of sort of the wider problem with the Sonderweg, and the special path, Germany's ideological special path, and this sort of reading of German history, in which sort of everything, from Goethe onward, or even long before Goethe, sort of a station on the way toward Nazism. And that's a narrative that has really come into question in historical circles, and sort of this incessant kind of reading of Wagner as somehow inevitably pointing towards Wagner is sort of part and parcel of that sort of problematic reading. And for an American speaking at a moment when we are trembling on the edge of a coup, frankly, an authoritarian takeover, the problem with the Sonderweg, the problem with this whole kind of reading of fascism, Nazism, authoritarianism, that can somehow sort of only happen in certain places because of a genetic cultural predisposition, is that it obscures our own vision, and so the famous novel by Sinclair Lewis, It Can't Happen Here, his imagination of an American fascism in the 1930s, a warning, about America's potential for fascism. Well, we think it can't happen here because we think it could only have happened there. And so that's the danger of Sonderweg for the Americans or people of sort of various other nations.
This fits now to ask an earlier question from Georgios Fragos. If it is possible not to take into account the Second World War, what other events shifts in society do you see as contributing to the decline of Wagnerism? And at the end of your book, you talk about sort of your not entirely optimistic outlook on the future of Wagnerism. But if you could elaborate a little bit.
Well, yeah, I mean, aside from the political issue, which really surfaces with the First World War, even before the Second World War, I mean, there was a great falling off, especially among the French Wagnerites, because of the First World War, because of the identification of Wagner with German aggression. Even before that, the Franco-Prussian War had sort of created a kind of crack in French Wagnerism, and in America as well. There's this urge to sort of ban everything German because it was inherently odious. But of course, there are other forces at work in this decline of Wagner as a cultural impetus and symbol. And it's in a very basic way. It's about the decline of Romanticism and the Romantic aesthetic, and for all of Wagner's modernity and sort of avant-garde tendencies and sort of prophetic kind of almost kind of experimentalism in his work. Wagner was a romantic, grand, flamboyant, epic. There was a kind of a sense of sort of wholeness, this search for a kind of total organism in Wagner, this seamlessness, this sort of all-encompassing, all-absorbing aesthetic, and in the 20th century, for all kinds of reasons, that aesthetic was fading from view, and so the sheer kind of romantic perfume sort of wafting around the Wagner operas, I think made it inevitable, no matter what happened politically, that Wagner would have receded as a cultural influence, and you can see that surfacing already at the end of the 19th century, where sort of people want to reject this weightiness, this heaviness, and Nietzsche's critique of Wagner twinned with the praise for Bizet, il faut méditerraniser la musique. This urge toward a new lightness, classicism, toward a new lucidity, or to a sort of sharper edged kind of aesthetic. Sort of all of this was sort of just turning away from just sort of the elemental characteristics of Wagner's work. So yeah, it was foreordained, I think. I think so many people, today struggle with Wagner simply because of that romantic grandiosity. It's something that's just very foreign now to our culture in so many ways. And so even before the sort of political issue kind of crosses their minds, just the whole atmosphere of the work is unfamiliar and alienating for that reason, which I think was maybe part of my own early response to Wagner as well.
There's a question from another one of our good friends, Joshua Barone, asks, the book's studies from the recent past, if I'm remembering correctly, come from the world of film. What do you think accounts for that? Or if that's not an accurate statement, what are the meaningful strands of Wagnerism you see today?
Hey, Josh, how's it going? It is, I mean, definitely in the last couple of chapters, I spend a great deal of time on film, just because Wagner has been so ubiquitous in film of the past 100 years. And so there's just so much to choose from. And sort of Wagner has taken on a life of his own in the film medium, somewhat independent from the work itself. I mean, the Ride of the Valkyries has become a kind of a new piece, a sort of a new object, you know, because of its uses in Hollywood, and with just it has this long chain of associations now, reaching back over the whole history of film. So it has sort of disappeared into the kind of just object cluster of sort of, you know, music on film. But there's a lot more to talk about, I think, in terms of Wagnerism in contemporary literature, or sort of, you know, literature since 1945. And I mentioned Bachmann and Philip K. Dick. There's a modest number of contemporary authors are still playing with Wagnerian themes. Alan Hollinghurst has a couple of wonderful Wagner scenes in the sort of old-fashioned sense in his novels. In painting, we have Kiefer. We have a kind of engagement with Gesamtkunstwerk concepts all through the contemporary arts. And I would say, in terms of, I mean, you know, in terms of opera itself, you know, theater itself, I think Wagner's influence on theatrical thinking and the ways in which theater directors have grappled with Wagner, especially in the post-1945 era, this has been a very rich strain of development, because I think this Wagner has compelled directors to seek solutions to these Wagner problems, which have yielded just sort of new modes of making theater. Wagner has propelled, I think, innovation and experiment in opera and perhaps in sort of the theatrical world more widely, because of this conviction that something has to be done about Wagner. But that impulse actually predates the issue of grappling with the political Wagner. And you know, it really surfaces at the end of the 19th century, and I'll show another picture here, with Adolf. And so,
well, while you're looking, I'll add to Joshua's question and to your answer. Susanna Malki says thank you, and says, if I may ask another one, it would be about the pop culture inspired by Wagner, which you're sort of talking about, and your comment about the Ride of the Valkyries was great. Do you think it's more about doing a kind of satire about people infatuated with Wagner in various ways, or about trying to keep a distance to the huge and irresistible influence of the operas? So partly you're already answering it, but just so you know that.
Do we see Appia here?
Not yet.
Okay, let me.
Sharing didn't come on this.
Try again. Share screen. Desktop.
Yeah, now we have something. Yeah.
Okay. All right, so here are a couple of Appia sketches for Wagner staging. On the left is, I believe this is Brunhilde's Rock. And on the right, this is Valhalla in Rheingold. And so the problem that Appia had with Wagner was not political at all. The problem was what he felt was the severe disparity between the advanced, sort of wondrously evocative and atmospheric qualities of the works themselves, principally in music, but also in terms of the drama, and what you were seeing on stage at Bayreuth, quite conservative, cluttered, quasi-naturalistic affair of, you know, people holding spears in costumes of various kinds in front of rocks and trees, and for him this was just jarring and upsetting, you know, to have such a conservative stage picture in conjunction with such radical music and drama. And so the visual element needed to catch up. And so this, Wagner drove Appiah's experiments in a mode of theatrical design, and Appiah became one of the pioneers of the modernist theater. And so this is the kind of effect that Wagner has had in theatrical history, and I think it just redoubled after 1945, or even before 1945. I mean, the great Flying Dutchman production of the Kroll Opera. In 1929, I think it was, 28, 29, was part of a general urge on the part of the left, broadly defined, in culture and politics, to make some of these sort of principal objects of German culture their own, and to sort of take them back from the right, as the rising Nazi movement was making more and more strident claim on Wagner. And so this sort of radically pared down Flying Dutchman production in sort of more or less in kind of rough contemporary dress was sort of a radical gesture in this sort of political battle over Wagner, and caused a huge controversy as a result. And so just because of the political problem of Wagner, it continues to drive theatrical innovation, and we see that unfolding constantly on stages today. And so, Wagner and popular culture. I think there is this defensive, sarcastic accent to popular culture's dabblings in Wagner, and you think of Bugs Bunny first and foremost. This mocking appropriation of Wagner, and so you sort of hear the Wagner motifs, and the motifs themselves are playing their role in sort of keeping the viewer interested. I mean, those motifs act upon the viewer and sort of pull the viewer along. But at the same time, Wagner is being mocked. Sort of the figure of the Wagner soprano is being mocked, and sort of the whole operatic apparatus. I think this is what popular culture has done with opera over and over again, not just Wagner, but sort of every other form of opera, sort of classical music in general. There's this urge to sort of put it down, sort of reduce it in significance, to mock it, to marginalize it, and to see it as effete and elite and a kind of alien import. As this is the implicit message is that in American popular culture, opera, classical music, Wagner, whatever it is, isn't really American. It isn't sort of truly American. It's something foreign. And that's an attitude that goes way back. It goes back to the 19th century, and fears that European classical music was harmful to American masculinity, especially that sort of, boys turned into sissies if they played too much piano. There's something sort of excessively feminine about classical music. So it actually plays into an American neurosis about gender and sexuality as well. And so it's a very widespread phenomenon. But yeah, it's just this basic contradiction where sort of, pop culture, Hollywood, and sort of various other forms of pop culture, it are attracted to Wagner, are attracted to the punchy, crisp effectiveness, of the leitmotifs, especially, and to the Wagnerian poses and gestures. But at the same time, it needs to be mocked, it needs to be critiqued, and it needs to be kind of set to the side. And then that becomes kind of another form of this elemental Nietzschean mechanism of infatuation, rejection, appropriation, transformation, in terms of this dealing with Wagner over and over again.
Yes, it seems like Wagner is really the perfect storm of this of a substance that's so rich and ripe for interpretation that like in a more limited musical scope, the other great composers, but also in terms of extra musical meanings, it seems a perfect storm that generates such a book as yours, where you, as I said in the beginning, you seem to point to all these avenues where yet another book could be written about the relationship of Wagner and Proust, and Wagner and Nietzsche, and whoever is not a pro-Wagner or a Wagnerist or into a Wagnerism is in some way also reacting because of the existence of this incredibly large gravitational object. So, so there's another 170 things at least that I'm sure all of us would want to ask you, but I think we have to be also fair to your time. I would love to hear at some point about Wagner and Acoustics, because obviously the Theodor Bayreuth is so special, and you must know a lot of sources where that is discussed, but I think that doesn't seem to be discussed so very much as it perhaps deserves, because it really seems to be a unique acoustical experiment. We had, or still have with us, Donato Cabrera, who also wanted to hear about your thoughts on Wagner's influence on the advent of the modern conductor. But I think we have to just basically hint at these themes, as the Germans say, andeuten, and then most importantly, to read your book, which incidentally I pasted the link before. I think it is this week, in fact, that the German translation is going to be available. I thought it's November 16th. That's either the website.
I think next week. Yeah, I think early next week. The German translation is Die Welt nach Wagner, which is a kind of nice pun. The world after Wagner, but also the world according to Wagner to some extent. So, yeah, magnificent labors on the part of my German translators. Quite impossible task. So
either in English or in German, but I think we'll be reading the book, and in some way through some virtual medium, I think more questions will filter to you also from our group. But I wanted to thank you for agreeing to speak about this magnum opus of yours, and I'm sure more to come, and obviously the first two to read, and to thank everyone for being here and for the stimulating questions. And let's continue. In fact, next week we continue to another influential figure in the history of music, but obviously quite a bit more in the shadows in comparison to Wagner. Everyone is. It will be C.P. Bach, Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, and Andreas Steyer, who kindly opened our series last semester, will make a return, come to speak about C.P. Bach's music and his influence on the subsequent musicians, which, as you know, is very strong. But for now, I wanted to thank you, Alex, for joining and talking so enticingly about this unending subject.
Thank you so much. It was an absolute delight, and I am admiring of all those who stayed while I droned on to the end. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a good evening, everyone, or good day on earlier time zones, and stay healthy, and more soon.
Okay, bye-bye.